Hello, everyone. This is like my third time trying to record this. Welcome to the Fanfic Reread Project. Today we are going to begin the first part of our reread of old prophs content. So prophs is in A Song of Ice and Fire fanfic that at this point is like 7 years old almost. I think this October will be the official 7th birthday of prophs. Good lord. However, due to the fact that this is A, so old, and B, has not had a solid story, Prophs is kind of hard to explain, but essentially it is an AU where certain world building changes have taken place and the changes factor into the story. In the current version, it's more about having all these different world building changes, but then creating a situation that still ends up in the same place where A Song of Ice and Fire starts, and then seeing what these different characters do with it. So even if the characters aren't entirely different people, they do have different backgrounds, and I think it would be interesting just to see them in these different situations. This is the first time I'm doing that intentionally, so old versions of prophs have a similar thing happen, but it's not on purpose. It's kind of hard for me to glean what the fuck prophs' point was before now, but hey, that's especially a thing in these early versions of prophs. But where prophs started is it was basically a fic where I think Bran in particular saw these prophecies of the future, and then the characters, I guess, reacted to that. I'm kind of vague on what exactly is going on because you don't see a lot of evidence of that until a little bit later. Another important thing to know about prophs is that pretty much every iteration of prophs is written with the characters having different names from the source material. So you'll see in the versions that we're reading today, all of the characters' names are in Elvish. Actually, I'm probably going to just change the characters' names because it's easier for me to pronounce the characters, but all of the characters' names are in Elvish. So like John is called Aisto and Ghost is called Fidi Sule, which I forget what that means, but they didn't have a word for ghost. But all of the names are in Tolkien Elvish. So some of the names were in Kenya, the other names were in Sindarin. Over time, I kind of moved away from that and gave all the characters from Westeros Earth names, but I designated different cultures to different regions to simulate that they have different cultures or whatever. You'll see that a little bit later. Elvish stuck around, but it became a cipher for Valyrian instead, and I kind of stuck with that for a while. And then I ditched it completely to make up a version where I made up my own languages before ditching that for a version where I just went back to everything being the way it was in A Song of Ice and Fire because I was like, what is the point of this? So now that that's out of the way, I hope I explained that. It is a weird cluster of fanfics, but let's jump right in. So this isn't the first thing that I ever wrote for this because I'm pretty sure I don't have that anymore, but this is one of the very earliest things that I ever wrote for this, and this is a Jon Snow chapter, so let's jump right in. Like I said, I'm probably going to change the names because it's easier to say the ones from A Song of Ice and Fire. Jon sat on his bed, fully dressed but in his socks. The space next to him felt empty, usually occupied by Ghost. He had left him outside. The pup could be silent as the ghost he was named for. Now that line's a little bit redundant when I changed this, but whatever. But he did not want to chance any extra noise, not on this night. He felt as if he was burning. He had put his fire out hours ago because of it. He was not sick, and yet he had a fever, again. His hands shook. His whole body shook. He wished he wouldn't. It would make it terribly hard to do anything quietly, and that was the key to everything he was doing tonight. He was not sure of the time, but he could not sit anymore. He rose from his bed and took his bag from the ground. He had only packed one. He didn't want to carry much. He picked up his cloak and his boots as well. Slowly he opened his door and entered the hall. It was dark and cool. None of the sconces were lit, and he was grateful. His stomach started to turn. He took a deep breath, but it did not calm. He didn't need to be ill right now. It would ruin everything. He made his way to the stone staircase at the end of the hall and started down. He had planned his path so that he only tread the stone ones. He planned the entire thing to... That always catches me off guard. There's a typo in that sentence. He planned the entire thing so that he'd make the least amount of noise. He only took stairs where his steps would be muffled by his socks. If he had to cross a hall, he made sure it was one with a rug, and he would not put on his shoes until he was out of the castle. He stopped on a landing halfway down. A strange feeling filled him, like something was tugging at his insides, trying to get him to travel down the hall he was nearest. He felt as if he was on fire now. His stomach turned to knots. He balled his fists, trying to make it all stop. He had to force himself to start down the stairs again. He allowed himself to slip on his boots once he was out of the door. Ghost was already there when he arrived. He was getting so big. He came up to John's waist when Greywind was still nipping at Rob's thighs. That was good, he thought. He needed to be big and strong. This was not a journey for a weakling. He wished he could say goodbye to Rob and Theon and Rickon and Bran, but he couldn't permit himself that luxury. No one could know what he was doing, not a single soul, not even his best friends and brothers. He was able to give Arya a gift at the least, a small sword he had made especially for her. He tucked it away in one of her trunks before they left. The caravan to King's Landing was already long gone now. He had waited 8 days, long enough for them to be too far to turn back. He had wondered if he was right to leave. At first, he thought maybe he was overreacting, but the longer the king's visit went on, the more miserable he became. The strange happenings started to pile up. First, Taro falling from the burn tower, even though he'd always been sure of foot before then, and then the man trying to end his life in his sickbed. Were it not for the wolf, his brother would be dead. He did not want to wait to be next. He wrapped his cloak around himself as he walked to the stable. He didn't feel he needed it now, but he knew it was freezing. The black fur was even darker in the night. It was cold enough for a summer snow, but the sky was clear. The stars hung in the deep blue fabric of the sky, a dark spot where the moon should be. John had to wake his horse and coax him out of the stable. He shushed his whinnying as he saddled him. They didn't want to wake any of the horses. Even so much as a bark would give away his presence. The horse was surprisingly quiet the rest of the way out. Alright, so let me pause right here. So my number one comment is that the sentences in this are like super short and choppy, and I keep wondering why. Not that all sentences have to be like long and flowy, because that gets old really quickly. This is something that we will see in later stuff that we read. If not in later versions of prophs before that, we will read some of my old Batman fanfics that definitely have run-on problems, and you'll see it there. But it is kind of weird if I feel like I just keep like getting to an end of a thing and stopping, and my mouth wants me to keep going. This is a problem I also had during the Hunger Games. Another big thing I want to note is that this chapter actually does a really good job of, or at least a half decent job, of like showing that John is running away from home without him actually saying it up to a point. Like, he does say at a point, oh, I'm gonna leave. But in those early paragraphs, he keeps talking about like, oh, we don't want to make too much noise because that will ruin everything tonight. And you definitely get the feeling that like he's planning something big. And then you start to realize like, oh, he's fucking leaving. Like, what? So I think this actually does a pretty good job of setting that up without coming out and saying it until it's kind of obvious. Thirdly, I think this chapter actually does a really good job of conveying how important this is to John by showing the lengths that he went to avoid being caught. Like, this is so important to him that he waits a specific amount of time so that his dad and them can't turn back without it being a waste of too much of their time. He leaves in the middle of the night, which is kind of obvious, but the way that he like plans out a specific route through the castle so that he walks on a specific type of stairs to make the least amount of noise, he wears socks and walks on rugs to muffle his footsteps. It's very meticulous, and it does show that John really, really cares about getting out of here, and it does convey the urgency of the situation really well, I think. So far this chapter is actually pretty decent, which is surprising. For something that was written in late 2012/early 2013, this is not bad at all. As he passed the library tower, he spotted a pair of ice blue eyes staring at him from a shadow. He knew at once that it was Mordred. He didn't know how the pup had gotten outside. He'd seen him enter the room with Theon in the evening. He waited for the pup to raise the alarm. He didn't make a sound. Just so you know, in this AU, Theon also has a wolf. However, because Theon doesn't have a wolf, the wolf doesn't have a proper name to refer to, so I'm just using his quote-unquote English, the language from our world version of the wolf's name, which is easier for me to say than trying to pronounce and butcher Elvish. He walked his horse all the way to the gate. He didn't dare mount him until he was outside of the wall. He did wonder if he was being too cautious, but he was so worried about getting caught. If even one person found him, everything would be lost. That was unthinkable. "Snow!" a voice hissed out behind him. He froze. He knew it was Theon without even looking. He knew the voice well. He turned to face him. A dark cloak was pulled tight around his shoulders. His sea-green eyes were filled with confusion. "How did you know?" John whispered. Theon retorted immediately. "Where the hell are you going?" "I asked you first." Theon sighed. "I heard you on the landing." "How?" "With my ears." "Where are you going?" I don't know why this is such a consistent thing throughout this, but Theon is like a genuine, like, hilarious comedian in all these. That's just his thing. I don't know why. I love it. "I'm leaving." John kept his answer vague. He was still intending to go, and he didn't want the ward to have any clue where he'd be. "You would too if you knew what was good for you." "I know what's good for me, and surely it isn't out there," he said, pointing to the lands beyond the gate. "What's out there, Snow? What do you want so badly that you'd creep out there in the middle of the night for it?" My life? Your death, Theon scoffed. If I wanted that, I'd be staying. What the hell are you talking about? You saw what happened to Bran just as well as I did. Why would anyone want to kill a boy of 10, Greyjoy? He fell, you know that. Funny how they were there to carry him back to the castle, don't you think? Theon's eyes widened. Are you accusing the queen of attempted murder? No, the Kingslayer. You have got to be joking. But he wasn't. Not a bit. Jon crossed his arms. I'm not staying. He felt a petulant child, but he had no choice. Honestly, there's nothing I can say to change your mind, is there? Jon just stared at him. You're a goddamn fool, you know that? Goddamn fool. Jon's eyes began to sting. Oh no, Jon. Theon reached into his cloak and pulled out a velvet pouch. Here. Robb told me to give you this, he said, throwing it to Jon. His guts began to turn again, his being Jon. Don't get yourself killed. Jon couldn't bring himself to say anything as Theon left. It was not what lay beyond the gates, but what was here in Winterfell. He wanted away from whoever was coming after his little brother. He wanted away from the Lady Catelyn's iron eyes and judgmental gaze. He wanted away from fevers of unexplainable origin and stomach knots and the feeling of his insides being set aflame. None of them understood, not even Theon, who was just as much of an outsider to this family as he was. He looked at the pouch in his hand. It weighed heavy. It felt like his stomach was doing somersaults. He stuffed it into his own bag. He couldn't stand the sight of it anymore. He took a breath to coax the bile rising in his throat back down to his gut. An ache began to form in his head. He climbed on his horse. He needed to get himself away from here as quick as possible. And that is the end of that chapter. So, that was not bad. I am always kind of shocked at the quality of some of the old stuff we read. The last few chapters of the Hunger Games, are they perfect? No, but they're pretty decent considering they were written in November of 2012. It's the same thing here. While I do think the prose of this is really choppy and the fake antiquating by dropping a bunch of contractions is a little bit tired, but overall this chapter does what it needs to do in a way that's the prose isn't just super distracting. And I think the dialogue is actually pretty good. There were a few weird repetitions here and there, but outside of that, I really did feel like this was two people in the Planetos world talking to each other, you know? And that's really nice. I think what's more surprising though is the fact that some of this older stuff is easier to read and more digestible than some of the stuff I would write later. And I guess my writing style changed for some reason or other that I don't really know why. I can take this weird choppy stuff a lot more than I can some of the later stuff that I wrote. But yeah, overall, this is pretty fucking decent. So, I guess let's move on to the next chapter. So, the next one is a Theon chapter, Theon chapter. So let's jump right in. The day had dawned gray and cloudy. A fire raged in the fireplace, yet it still felt cold. Theon sat in the chair by Robb's bed as Robb leaned on his bed frame. Neither of them spoke. They were both reeling from Jon's disappearance into the night. He never told you where he was going? Robb asked him. No, he just said he was leaving, that's all. A howl permeated the walls. It was Shaggy Dog, he could tell. Grey Wind followed. They'd been constant at it since the day Bran was attacked. Their sound had grown melancholy. Mordred never joined them. He never knew why. It doesn't make sense, Robb said, rising from the bed. He was on the bed? It said he was leaning on his bed frame. I took that to mean that he was standing next to his bed, talking to Theon in the chair, but I guess not. Maybe he was leaning back on it. I should have made that more clear. It doesn't make sense, Robb said, rising from the bed. Why would he go? What's out there for him? That's what I asked him, Theon replied, shaking his head. It was completely out of character for Jon to act this way, Theon knew. The prospect of being subject to Lady Catelyn was not worth running off in the middle of the night into the wilderness, and he was not sure he fully believed his accusations against Lord Jaime. Oh, Jaime's a lord in this? I forgot about that, shit. He didn't like the man much himself, but he did not think him a killer, or at least, not anymore. They both turned at the sound of a knock. Robb went to the door. My lords. Roderick? Lewin? Who is this? It's just his new name. Fuck. The person said to them, the lady requests your presence. They both looked at each other, then followed him out of the door. He led them to the lady's chambers. He'd never seen them before. He never had reason to. That's Theon, who had never had reason to. Kat sat in the chair by the fireplace, a solemn look in her eye. The bandages that covered her hands before were gone, but the scars remained. Maester Lewin was there as well, by her side. My lady, Roderick said when they entered. I'm assuming it's Roderick. She rose from her chair. Close the door, Roderick. This must not leave the room. He heeded her words. Swear to me that you won't tell anyone what I'm about to say. It could mean the life of my husband and daughters. I swear it on the old gods, my lady, Roderick said, and I on the new, Lewin said after. I swear it too, Theon said. And you, Rob? She said. He nodded. All right, you know, just as I do, that the knife used to attack my son was too fine a blade for the man wielding it. Theon remembered it well. Cloudy red dragon glass on a dragon bone hilt. Just to note that throughout most of the versions of Prophs up until Prophs 5.0, the current version, instead of Valyrian steel, dragon glass was used, which is not obsidian. It's not actual, like, it's not rock that looks like glass. It's actual glass that's just, like, super thick and super strong. It has all the same properties of Valyrian steel, but it's not steel. So, moving on. My sister, Lysa, thinks that the Lannisters murdered her husband, Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King. I remember now, Lord Jaime Lannister, it's a lot of names here, did not join the men on their hunt the day Bran fell. I have good reason to believe that he had not fallen at all. He was pushed. Everyone was silent. Theon was shocked. But, my lady, Roderick began, breaking the static, even the Kingslayer would not murder an innocent child. Are we so sure? Theon said quietly. What are you saying? Roderick said back to him. Bran had always been sure-footed before, Lewin said. And if he was found, Robb said, his head would be on the stone immediately. But what of the queen, my lady? Roderick asked. Do you mean to accuse her of attempted murder? Theon tensed at the sound of the words he himself had said to Jon the night before. I don't know, the lady said, but I'm not sure we can trust anyone who bears the lion of Lannister. I'm sorry, I'm really trying to, like, change these so I don't have to speak excessive amounts of Elvish, but oh my god, there was so much name dropping in that one paragraph that Cat had. Good lord. It's a very, like, as you know, like, she did not have to say, my sister Lysa thinks that her husband, the Hand of the King, like, that was really weird. Do we have the proof? Lewin said. The proof is in the blade, Robb replied. A dagger like that won't have disappeared unnoticed, even from the Lannisters. I'll go to King's Landing myself. Someone must tell my father. No, you are the Lord of Winterfell. You must stay here. Catelyn was silent a moment. I'll go. Surely they'll greet your arrival with suspicion, Lewin said. And what about Bran? Robb added. His life is in the hands of the gods. I've done all I can. I have other children to worry about now. You need someone to go with you, my lady. I volunteer myself. Theon thought it was the least he could do after not believing Jon. He could feel Robb's eyes on him. Oh, Theon? I hope he feels my eyes on him. You belong at my son's side, Greyjoy, but I appreciate your offer. If I might, Roderick, I'm requesting your company. Anything you might ask, my lady, he said, bowing his head. Good. We will go the White Knife and hire a ship to take us south. I won't chance the King's Road. We will make King's Landing before the caravan, I'm sure. The two of us will move faster than the hundreds of them. When the lady dismissed them, Theon headed down the stairs, intending on the Godswood. He could hear her... He could hear her. Sorry. He could hear Robb behind him. Where are you going? He asked, bewildered. I'm going to pray, Theon said, turning. You never pray. What was that back there? Come with me, then. I need to tell you something anyway. Robb followed him the rest of the way down and out of the door. Okay, this is a weird note because this is not something we're gonna see until, like, I think, maybe not the next version of Prophs, but the version after that, which won't be for a few episodes. But the way that this scene is arranged, I feel like the surprise of, oh my god, Theon's going to pray is kind of ruined by the fact that the inner monologue literally says that Theon is going to the Godswood. Like, why else would he go there? In later versions, I don't remember if it actually says, like, oh, he was intending to go to the Godswood, but I feel like if he had said, like, Theon's going down to the Great Hall and out of the castle, and Robb's like, well, where the fuck are you going? And he's like, I'm going to pray. And Robb's like, what? And then Theon's like, well, come with me, you know. Also dropping the part, he's like, you never pray. And it's like, clearly we get the implication if Robb is just shocked. The morning was gray as could be, but the Godswood looked as if it stood in full light. The leaves glowed green as if the sun was shining through them. The grasses and mosses seemed illuminated. The pines and sentinels here were full of color, nothing like the dark ones in the Wolfwood. Lord Stark said it was illuminated by the old gods, and so it always seemed a light, even in the night. Number one, I feel like this is too long to imply, like, oh, it's so full of light. Like, I get it after the first sentence. But also, I feel like it would have been more striking to see this at night. Which there is a version of Prophs that actually does show off this little aspect of, you know, the Godswood always looks like it's being lit at nighttime, which I think is pretty impressive. But, we'll talk about that. That's, like, way later, so we'll talk about that when we talk about that. The heart tree always stood out amongst the others. It was the tallest tree in the wood, towering over the others, with black black leaves and satiny gray bark that was marked with scars and holes. The sap was thick burgundy and stained the ground beneath it a deep dark red. It used to scare him. It always looked as if it were bleeding, but now he found comfort in the sight of it. The only thing that changes more constantly than the languages that I use in prophs is the appearance of the equivalent of the weirwood trees. I think this version that I'm doing now is the first time where the weirwood trees actually look like weirwood trees from A Song of Ice and Fire. It's nuts. The wolves... No! I closed the file. Fuck. Turn on. The wolves met them as soon as they entered the gate, all except Brands, who he knew was probably lingering around the tower. Shaggy Dog did not linger, but Grey Wind and Mordred followed them to the glassy pool that lay in the middle of the wood. It gleamed blue-green, as if made of crystal. "What has gotten into you?" Rob said to him. Theon didn't waste any time with his answer. "Last night, when John left, he said he feared for his life because of what happened to Bran. You never told me that. And everything your mother said in that room, he said it too. Everything about the Kingslayer. But how could he be sure? And why didn't you tell me this before? You never asked." Theon! Rob gave him a look, and anyway, he mentioned how the queen carried him back. He said it was too convenient that she and the Kingslayer were there, and he was fearing that he would be next. Theon nodded. Damn it all to hell. But why would he run off like that without telling anyone? I guess he doesn't want to be found, Theon said with a shrug. But by whom? Us or them? I don't see how the Lannisters are more dangerous than whatever he might run into out there, wherever he went. Rob looked down. He's a child. Only a child would run from one danger into another that way, because it doesn't know any better. But is he? Maybe he's right. Maybe we should have gone with him. No, I'm the Lord of Winterfell now, he said, echoing his mother's words. I can't leave. Can't stop you, though. There's nothing out there for me. But what was out there for John? I don't know. Aren't your people the men of winter? Yes, but what about you? I'm no Stark. Rob turned and left him in the Godswood. He felt Mordred brush up against his leg. Haha, I like the way that ends. So that is the end of that chapter. So I feel like this one is not as good as the previous one, but it's not bad. I would say the weakest part of the chapter is actually the part where it veers back into copying events from A Song of Ice and Fire, oddly enough. And I think it's because that section of the story doesn't feel like it really adds anything new, as well as the fact that the name dropping is so ridiculous. But the parts where Rob and Theon are actually trying to figure out what the fuck John was up to and why he's running away, I think actually do work as good foreshadowing for what is about to happen. It makes sense that the two of them would. Well, I will actually say that as far as I can remember, especially in the book, but I'm not sure if this is a thing in the show as well, Theon and Jon don't actually like each other all that much. So the fact that Theon is this worried about it does show a big difference in his character, and we see quite a bit of that in this, with Theon volunteering to go with Cat instead of Cat like he does in the source material. Oh, I don't know if he does it in the source material, but definitely in the show this was a thing, and that's pretty interesting. And even Rob is like, what? Like, it does show that Theon is a different character than he is in the source materials, you know? So this chapter wasn't bad. I actually really liked the end part. I think it could have been better, but I think that's because I'm recalling newer versions of the chapter that are slightly better, but it's definitely not bad. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here. So in the original recording for this, I said that the next chapter we would be reading would be the last chapter. However, that is not actually the case. It turned out that what I had intended to be content for the next episode did not cover nearly as much time as I needed it to. So instead, this is just another chapter that we're going to read, and this is a Bran chapter, which I also didn't mention for some reason. So let's jump right in. From his place in the clouds, he could see everything. Bran knew that there was no way he could be up this far. Not really, but it felt so real to him. He could feel the air on his face as winds blew past. He sat in a chair. No, a throne, made in silver and black obsidian, covered in ornate, ancient-looking designs. It was so large that his feet did not touch the ground when he sat back. He didn't think this throne was made for him, no. He thought it would fit someone more like King Robert or his father, since it was made in the colors of the Starks. The sky was purpling pink above him, like the twilight during the low summer. Millions of stars sparkled across the vast expanse, more than he'd ever seen, more than he thought could even fit in the sky above Winterfell. Land was just visible over the edge of the cloud. He had to slide forward to get to his feet. At first he did not believe he had touched the ground. It was solid beneath him and felt like fine polished stone, but when he looked he saw the cottony surface of clouds. When he lifted them, they came back wet. What is them? Is that his hands? He was afraid to go to the edge at first. What if he should fall? But curiosity got the best of him. What land lay below him? He had to know. He got on his hands and knees and peered over the fluffy sides. It seemed as if the entire realm had been laid out below him. He recognized it from the maps. Everything from the lands of always winter, beyond the wall, far... What? Okay, this is a little confusing because apparently the lands beyond the wall have a name, like a proper name, and I don't know why. In this version anyway, I've had versions of things where certain lands beyond the wall have a proper name, but not like... This is weird. Everything from the lands of always winter, far north of the wall, to the coast of Dorne and further south still. He could see the lush cities of the eastern continent, Essos, and the northernmost tip of Sothoros beyond the summer sea. Excuse me. Only the furthest reaches of Essos and Sothoros escaped his newfound vision. I love how he sees exactly the map of the known world. He turned his eyes back to the north. The lands above Winterfell turned whiter as they moved towards the wall. He almost missed the wolf that moved across them. He knew it was Ghost. His bright red eyes were unmistakable. But what was he doing out there away from home? And where was Jon? The wolf looked as if he was headed to the wall. Had he run off? The sight of more caught his eye. There were wolves in Winterfell, too. That made sense to him. He could see Shaggy Dog and Greywind in the God's Wood, and Mordred and his own wolf in the castle. He couldn't see his brothers or the ward or his mother or even himself. Had they all gone? That seemed impossible. How does Bran know that he would see himself? Whatever, it's a dream. His eyes moved further south. He caught the glimpse of something in the white knife, the quickest flash of red. He soon saw it was a great fish, swimming swiftly toward the coast. He recognized it as the symbol of the House Tully, his mother's house. But they were of the south. The white knife was still in the north. He wondered how that had gotten there. I love this chapter, or as I like to call it, Bran lampshades everything that's happening right now. Good lord. I wonder how that's there. He caught a great sight on the King's Road. A large parade of spectacular animals moved slowly toward King's Landing. He noticed Lady and Nymeria among them, as well as a darker wolf he'd never seen. There were great silver serpents with giant antlers of deep blue dragon glass that slithered across the dirt road, and giant cats with gleaming coats of gold. I don't know what that's called, and the lion. He knew them from his lessons. So the serpents in this version of the story, they're the sigil of House Baratheon. So basically in prophs, and this is something that's actually consistent in prophs up until the most recent version, instead of Orys Baratheon giving the house his name and then taking the coat of arms and the motto and stuff, he instead gives the house the sigil while taking the name and the words. The serpent with the antlers was his personal arms, which it's some type of mythical creature from Valyrian folklore that, again, I don't know the name of. I never made up a name for it in English, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, it's just like that antlered serpent. So you'll see it a few times throughout this instead of the stag necessarily. The sights became more unbelievable as he looked further south. Lions roamed the west, and Ars Luca, which I'll just use the name, slithered through the Stormlands and Dragonstone. The great green tentacles of the Kraken thrashed about in the frothy waters around the Iron Islands. The lands of the Reach were heavy with bright white flowers. In the east, in Essos, he could see red dragons moving in a sea of labor, not horses, toward the continent's interior. A large black serpent circled beneath the waters of the Dragonstone. Okay, so just to go across that, most of these are pretty obvious. Instead of riding horses, the Dothraki in the old versions of Prophs rode these weird, like, lizard horses that were called Lobor, and I don't remember what they were called after this. They were called, like, Rocks or something like that? I'm not sure. Like, rock as in R-A-K-H, I think. They were lizard horses, so that's a thing that you're going to see a few times throughout this, especially when we get to the Daenerys chapters that are in here, but we're probably going to read those either next episode or the episode after that. Also, what the fuck is that giant black serpent? What? He pulled himself back from the edge. He could not believe his eyes. The sights that lay before him were awe-inspiring and mind-boggling. What could it all mean? He made to look at them again when something else caught his sight. He hadn't noticed it before, but he didn't see how he could have missed it. It seemed as if a shadow had cast itself about the east of the continent, over the Crownlands and the Stormlands. He couldn't make out any type of shape. He leaned closer. The color of it was odd when he felt a push at his back. He screamed as he fell. Surely he would die. There was no way he couldn't. He watched in horror as the ground rushed toward him. He closed his eyes and waited for the impact. It never came. When he opened his eyes, he found himself in a room, its walls covered in vine and blossom tapestries. How had he gotten there? Was he there the whole time? The air around him was chilly, and he noticed that he was covered in many blankets. His whole body seemed to shiver. There was a great deal of noise beyond the doors. What was going on out there? He got his answer when Rob came bursting through the doors. His face was reddened and his breathing was heavy. Had he run there? He guessed he might be in a tower. Wow, Bran is actually really, observant. Of course, we'd see him, asking questions constantly, which started to wear on me after a while, but here, he's like, oh, Rob's face is red and he was running. I must be upstairs somewhere. That's nice. That's a smart thing. A smile crossed Rob's face when he looked at him. A pair of yellow eyes stared at him from the corner. He knew it was his pup. He could barely be called a pup anymore. He was larger than any of the dogs in the kennel. The wolf climbed on the bed and began to lick his face. A word hovered in his mind as he pet him, a whisper from some unknown voice. Summer, he said to Rob. I'll call him Summer. And that's the end of that. So that was interesting. I think it was an interesting take on Bran's dream from the books. It's interesting because in the books, Bran flies, which is significant because of the whole three-eyed crow sort of stuff. Here, instead, because that is not in this, presumably, he is on a cloud in the sky. I just think it's interesting that he sees everything represented by the sigils and stuff. It's just an interesting take on it. What I want to know is what the fuck the throne means. What is the symbolism of that? That's what I want to know. But yeah, that wasn't bad. It had some of the same issues that the Jon chapter had, but I didn't hate it. So it turns out there is a little bit more of one more chapter before we get to the asterisks. So I'll just tell you right now that this chapter is actually from the point of view of Joffrey. So that's a big change. So let's get right into it. Did they tell you that the bastard ran away? His uncle asked him over the table. Joffrey shook his head. He hadn't spoken to anybody that day. He had no way of knowing anything. That seemed to explain everything. Why his mother took lunch alone and why Lord Stark asked Sansa to eat with him. Why does that explain why Cersei took lunch alone? You know what? I feel like this is missing some context. That would make more sense if we knew more about Cersei as a character in this, but when you see it alone, it's like, why does she care? But anyway, he sat alone with his Uncle Jaime in the guest house dining room. The one in Derry was much bigger than the one in Winterfell. The walls were painted with the clouds and morning sun, bright and shining. The sconces along the walls held yellowed lights instead of flickering flames. Oh, so that's an interesting thing. We've got a big tech jump here. Lights don't exist in Planetos. Everything seemed lighter once they had passed the neck. Color slowly seeped back into the world, past Moat Cailin. As they traveled, he watched the sky above them turn bluer. When he had looked down the King's Road, a blanket of clouds stretched back toward the north, growing darker the further he looked. So is the north, supernaturally always gray? That's kind of interesting. Anyway, why would he run away, Joffrey asked. Winterfell seemed nice enough, albeit a little cold. Joffrey? Oh God. Who knows? They're impulsive, the baseborn are, Jaime said after a bite of eggs. Can never tell what they'll do. Stark never should have brought him into the home. Nothing but trouble. Joffrey didn't know whether he should be agreeing or not. He'd always heard they were nothing but trouble, like his uncle said, reckless and impulsive and fast. But were they really the way everyone said they were? He didn't know himself. He'd never known one, and he barely laid eyes on Jon when they were at Winterfell. So that's all there is of that. I don't know what happened to the rest of that chapter because as far as I know from the next few versions onward, that chapter is written from another character's point of view completely. So I don't know. Maybe I just started that and then threw it away and switched to the version where it's from Arya's point of view instead. But so yeah. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here once again. So we are actually going to be reading a bit more. I kind of implied that earlier with another insert that I had. We are going to read the rest of Joffrey's chapters, which will add a sexy 15 to 20 minutes to this episode, but whatever. So now we are going to get into the next Joffrey chapter. This rewinds in time from the chapter that we just read, just so you know. This Winterfell seemed a massive place. The stone gates towered over them as their caravan entered. The castle itself seemed miles away, though they were already on the grounds. Everything was gray as well, from the stone walls to the dirt beneath the horses' hooves, and even the sky above it. It seemed drab, but somehow alive. Probably because people live there, Joffrey. Joffrey pulled his cloak around himself. It was colder up here, colder than it ever got in King's Landing. The air had gotten progressively cooler as they moved up the King's Road. He thought it might even be cold enough for snow. It hardly ever snowed down in the south. Summer seemed longer for them. I mean, that's a keen observation, but also, it is a little weird that in this story, apparently, the south is like capitalized as if it's a physical place called the South and not just the south of Westeros. But anyway. He noticed that his father seemed to come alive when they passed through the gates. He knew that he and Lord Stark were old friends. They'd squired together, gone to war together, and won the kingdom together. They'd probably have slain the Mad King together, but his uncle beat them to it. Did they squire together? I don't know. That line pops up in a lot of different versions of prophs. I don't know if there are changes later on. I guess we'll see when we get to that way later down the line. But yeah, that's just interesting. But anyway, he could see him up at the front as well, the purple velvet pulled tight around his shoulders. He disliked the north as soon as they stepped past the walls of Moat Cailin. He was a southerner through and through. He quietly complained of everything until his other uncle, Tyrion, had told him to shut up. Tyrion seemed much more intrigued by the place, though he said he could never live there. Joffrey agreed with him on that. So yeah, the Lannister colors are purple and gold here. I think I did it to sort of hint at their ambitiousness, because purple is like a royal color, and the Lannisters want to be like on the Iron Throne. One thing I will say is that I feel like there is a lot of Elvish in here that doesn't need to be in Elvish. Things like Southerner and South don't need to be in Elvish. Like the North being in Elvish makes sense because that's actually the name of that region, but just saying, oh, he's a Southerner through and through, it's like peppering in a language that a lot of people don't know. It just makes it harder to read. It seemed like it'd been forever until they reached the castle. The whole of House Stark were lined up in front of the doors. Lord Stark stood at the head. His long brown hair was streaked with gray and came to his shoulders. He could see the brown marks on his face, spots that went diagonally across his cheek and neck. Lady Stark stood next to him, all her shades red, sprays of freckles covering her face. Oh, this is another aspect. I'm sorry to keep stopping like every paragraph, but this is another little aspect that kept cropping up in different versions of prophs. Up until I think about prophs 3.0, this was a thing. Different people having birthmarks, and different families having birthmarks more so. However, I will say that this at least did play into the prophs thing. So what I would do, and I think it comes up in this one, but it came up a lot in the later versions, is the characters would have the family birthmark in a really like specific place that kind of said something about them. So not to spoil anything from later versions, if this even has any written content, but there's like a version of prophs where the Jaime character has the red birthmark of House Lannister on his right hand. Ha 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 ha. You know, things like that. And it was used to be like symbolic, and it played into the whole like prophecies thing because it was another form of foreshadowing, and that's kind of what prophs turned into. Instead of it being like Bran's having all these visions, like there was that, even though it got transferred to another character later down the line, but there was also more little details of things that were sort of prophetic. But moving on. His father jumped off his horse and approached Lord Stark. Eddard, it's been too long. The Lord bowed his head. Your Grace, Winterfell is yours. His father looked him up and down. I know it's his dad, but it's really weird that it never says, even just the king or anything like that, to indicate, like, he never says Robert's name. I don't know, it's weird. You've gotten fat, he said disapprovingly. He saw the Lord tense, and then his eyes flicked down to his father's immense gut. His father let out a laugh and pulled him into a crushing hug. That is another moment that's actually, like, only in the show, and it shows up in, like, every single version of prophs for some reason. I guess I really thought that was funny. I don't know. It's weird. Every version of prophs that has this chapter in it has that moment. He dismounted his horse as the rest of their party did. He moved to the door of the wheelhouse as Sir, I don't know, let's say Meryn Trant, it doesn't say which member of the Kingsguard this is, opened the door for his mother. She stepped from the thing in a simple yet fine gown in the blue of her king and a heavy fur around her slender shoulders. Already Cersei is a completely different character. Her eyes were wide in awe as she looked at the castle ahead of them. His siblings followed her out. He gave Myrcella his arm, and Tommen followed by his side. He followed her to the front, and the families were presented to each other. The Stark children looked the melting pot of their mother and father's features, a mix of brown and auburn hair, gray and blue eyes, freckles and spots. He saw a boy behind them that was the spitting image of the Lord, and another beside him, blonde and green-eyed, the bastard and the ward, he guessed. The Lord's eldest daughter was the one that really caught his eye. Oh boy. She looked just like Lady Stark, but young and slender with eyes that shine like the most brilliant silver. He thought her the epitome of beauty, maybe the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She turned her shining eyes on him and smiled. He returned it. He could have sworn he'd seen the oldest voice straighten when he did. Another moment from the show. But it is interesting that Sansa's eyes are silver. That's something that's actually kind of continued through a lot of versions of prophs, but we can talk about that a little bit more later. After they were through with all the formalities, his father turned back to the Lord. "Take me to the crypts, Eddard. I'd like to pay my respects." His mother straightened, but then gave them a small nod. One of the servants ran to fetch them lanterns. "Where is father going?" Marcella asked him as the servants led them into the castle, to pay his respects to the Lady Lyanna. He knew she had been Lord Stark's lady sister and his father's betrothed. He knew his father had risen and rebelled against the Mad King because the Prince Rhaegar had kidnapped her. He didn't like that his father went to see his former love when he hadn't spoken to his own wife in almost a day, but there was nothing he could do about that. Okay, I'm gonna pause right here because a few things. Number one, the way that this story always puts "the" in front of like a important person's like title and name is a little bit weird. I think it works better sort of when you're reading it in the language that it's written in, to an extent. And this is a thing that they do in the books sometimes. Like they'll say, "My lord, the Lady Stark," like when they're presenting someone, but it's not something people do all the time, you know? It just feels like a little bit off, like you're throwing a word in there that doesn't always need to be in there, you know? However, more important, I think, is the fact that Joffrey seems to be more upset about his dad going to pay his respects to Lyanna than Cersei is. Like I said, Cersei here is a very different character, and this is something that you will see throughout many different versions of prophs. That was kind of a thing that just, I don't want to say it just happened, but it was one of the bigger changes that sort of started out from the beginning, and is actually, I think Cersei is the main reason why I ended up changing the names quite a bit, but it continued into later versions. It's still sort of a thing now, but not to the same extent as it is in some of these earlier ones. And I guess how Cersei is different kind of changes a little bit between them, but there's definitely like through lines. So anyway, let's get back to this. "Couldn't he have waited?" his Uncle Jaime said, taking his mother by the arm. "We've traveled all this way in this dreadful cold. She would still be there after we've rested." "Is that any way to speak of my husband, brother?" his mother said to him. "The dead would wait, dear sister. He's the king. If he'd like to go to the crypts as soon as he comes on the grounds, he can." He suddenly lowered his voice. Joffrey knew that it was so they couldn't hear, but he heard him anyway. "Doesn't it bother you that he still kneels at the foot of his former betrothed when she has been dead for 17 years? You act as if she would steal him away," Tyrion said, hobbling up between them. He was at least 2 feet shorter than either of them. "He should be kneeling to his queen." "He is insatiable," Tyrion said, in a tone so hushed that Joffrey was straining to hear him. "But even Robert would not bet a corpse, brother." "Are you so sure?" Jaime said back to him. "Really," his mother said, disgusted. "You both go too far." She came back and took both of his siblings by the hand, and a servant led them down the hall. He had started to follow, but his uncle called for him to stay. So that's a moment. I feel like this moment does make sense given the characters involved. Like, again, Jaime is a little bit how different Jaime is not immediately evident here. We'll see it more later. When we get to Prophs 2.0, it's a lot more obvious. But again, like I said, given the characters here, this makes sense. I just find it weird that this all happens in front of the children. Like, I know it's like, oh, Jaime lowers his voice so they can't hear, but they're still back there. Like... In later versions, this chapter is told from someone else's POV, so them overhearing this is deliberately them, like, eavesdropping. Well, not, like, them doing it on purpose, but me deliberately writing them eavesdropping on a conversation they have no business hearing. It's a little bit different. "You," Jaime said, putting an arm around his shoulders. "Oh, God." "I saw the way you looked at that girl." A smile broke across his face. "Sansa, wasn't she called, brother?" Tyrion nodded. "That she was. The Tullys know how to make a woman, I'll tell you that." He felt himself grow red at the mention of it all, but inside he couldn't agree more. Oh, God. This would be cute if Tyrion and Jaime weren't being so weird right now. She was pretty, wasn't she? "Pretty," Joffrey scoffed. "She was bloody gorgeous." Oh, both of his uncles laughed. "I think our prince might be in love," Jaime said. What the fuck? I feel like a weird, like, secondhand embarrassment reading this. Like, I'm watching this and I'm just like, ugh, men, you know? God. "Good." They all whipped around at the sound of his father's voice. Servants rushed to pull the cloak from his shoulders and the lantern from his hands. She'll be your wife in a few years. What? He said, eyes widening. We've been needing a new hand to the king. I've chosen Lord Stark. You two will be joining our houses. It was the best news he'd gotten in a while. Oh, that's great. That Joffrey, I tell you what, he's such a good boy. So, that's over. It's not bad. It's funny because like the Theon chapter that we read where it kind of like in the middle suddenly veered back into being a book chapter, this really does just retell the events of this chapter in the book. However, I feel like this is a lot more inspired somehow. I don't know. Maybe I just didn't like that scene in particular for some reason outside of it being like just a straight adaptation sort of. But I feel like this was better done. And I was 100% more interested in everything that was happening, even though this is literally exactly like, maybe not 100% exactly, but it's for the most part follows the exact events that happen in the show at least, you know? But I enjoyed it. It wasn't bad. I don't think the writing was super bad. It was readable. All the characters, you got a really good sense of the kind of people they were. I think it was a good introduction to the royal family, barring Tommen and Myrcella, who kind of were just there. But like, even Cersei, who wasn't in it a lot, but like, especially Jaime, even Tyrion, who also wasn't there all that much. And especially Joffrey, which is really good because Joffrey is a very different character in these stories. So I think this chapter actually did a really good job introducing all these different people and their differences, sort of, to you, you know? So yeah, I actually kind of like that. This is something that you can get used to as we go through prophs, not only in these episodes, barring the Dany chapters that we'll read toward the end of this section of this reread. Throughout different versions of prophs, a thing that I always maintained is that I never really wanted to have a chapter from the book told from the point of view of the same character who had it in the book, as a way to sort of switch things up. So that's like why that Theon chapter is from Theon's point of view instead of being Cat. Why this chapter is Joffrey instead of Ned, and in later versions it switches back and forth between Bran and Arya. I always wanted to take a chapter and show it from a new perspective, so even if it's just showing something that happened before, you're getting a different like viewpoint of it. I hope that makes sense. But this is something that definitely comes up multiple times, and we can talk about it more when we get to Prophs 2.0, which is kind of down the line from this. One thing about this is that this batch is all Joffrey chapters, so there's going to be some context chapters missing. So we're skipping quite a bit ahead here for this next one. He could not, for the life of him, figure out why things had gotten so strange. Things had gone fine at first. His father caught a spectacular boar on the hunt, as he usually did. He was still quite the huntsman despite his size, and the feast had been brilliant. Despite that, that was when things had gone weird. The Lady Stark was not present at the feast, and later that night they'd been informed that Bran was no longer traveling south with them. His father had decided it, and was unmoving in his decision. Bran's wolf had gone missing as well. What? And this morning, they'd been told that after a search of the grounds, he was nowhere to be found. He sat in the dining room of the guest house, still utterly confused. Breakfast had been laid out in the dark wooden... Okay, that is supposed to say one. That's a typo. That wasn't me. Breakfast had been laid out on the dark wooden table, the usual heavy fare of the north, which he'd grown to enjoy as their trip had gone on, but his food was untouched save for his juice. He'd been too deep in thought to think of eating. He was so distracted that he hadn't even noticed that his name had been called at first. His head popped up at the second mention of his name. Yes, uncle, he said across the table. You haven't touched your plate, Jaime said to him. Oh, he said, looking down. He hadn't noticed that either. But he just described it to us. Anyway, I'm not all that hungry. May I be excused? He said, turning to his mother. We've got a long trip ahead of us. It's fine, his mother answered, cutting his uncle off. He muttered a thank you as he rose from the table. Can I be excused too, mother? He heard Tommen say behind him. He chuckled. His brother always wanted to follow behind him. So I know we're not into this chapter super far, but there has been a lot of repetition. I don't know what's up with that. That's kind of a thing that pops up in all of this stuff. So I think it's just a matter of me not having all of the words that I needed to like convey what I was saying. And also I don't think any of these were edited, so I didn't like cut them out. As he left the building, he ran into his other uncle. Where were you? He said to him. Is that any way to speak to your elders? Tyrion said. He looked tired. Excuse me, Joffrey said. Where have you been, Lord Tyrion? Ow! He buckled slightly as his uncle's small foot connected with his shin. I don't know about a king, Tyrion said as he moved to the door, but you are a right royal pain in the ass. Why did get Tyrion to kick him. I know he's just like, Joffrey's being like sarcastic and annoying, but like, good God. He must have been up in the library all night. Joffrey knew he had taken to it when they arrived. He never knew his uncle to be so direct before. He was usually one for words. He looked up to see Sandor Clegane staring down at him through the dark visor of his armor's helmet. Before he could even say a word, Joffrey just answered, "No." He hobbled off toward the yard. It was fairly early, but the yard was filled with people, his father's men and the servants readying the caravan for their journey. It was far too loud out here. He couldn't think, and that was what he wanted to do most right now. He looked up, wondering when the black leaves caught his eye. The godswood it was, then. The day had dawned cloudy, but the godswood looked as if it stood in the brightest of sun. The leaves and grasses illuminated green, and the barks and even the ground were rich browns. He was taken aback by it at first, and then struck by its beauty second. They had godswoods in the south, but none of them looked like this. None of them had heart trees either. The word for heart tree changed between these. I'm wondering if it's like one was heart tree specifically and the other was like the species. I don't know. But none of them had heart trees either. They'd all been chopped down when the conqueror came to the land, and everyone south of the neck started worshipping the seven, his gods. All right. Once he stopped marveling at it, he moved into it to further escape the sounds of the yard. He could see the wolves about it. Greywind was wandering in one part with Ghost and Mordred following behind him, and Shaggy Dog was wrestling with a large vine. He knew Nymeria was in the tower with Arya. Lady sat by herself at the edge of a glass green pool under the heart tree. Yeah, oh no, the other word showed up here too. They must be different words. I guess one is weirwood. The tree was spectacular up close. He'd only ever seen them in paintings and photographs. Now they have photographs. Look at this graph. It rose above the others, its black leaves looking as if they touched the sky and mingling with the pines of the others. Its bark was a rich red and brown. He went to feel the grooves in the trunk, but his hand met stickiness. He snatched it back immediately. The sap of the tree covered his hands, painting his palm red. It looked like it was covered in blood. That feels obvious. When he looked down, he saw that the dirt beneath him was stained the same color. Lady was at his side, licking the sap from his hands. "Don't do that," he said to her, but she still licked his hand clean. "Thanks, then," he said with a chuckle. He wiped it dry on its pants. I don't know why that moment reminded me of Harry Potter, but anyway. Now that he was finally unoccupied, he turned back to his thoughts. His mother had been in a strange mood since they had returned from the hunt yesterday. The life seemed to have been pulled out of her. She was in tears when they had gotten the news about Bran. He knew she was fond of the Stark children, even the bastard, but it seemed absurd. I think what's absurd is the fact that Cersei is apparently fond of Jon. This is that new Cersei, that different Cersei. His thoughts were interrupted again by Lady at his elbow. "What is it, girl?" he had started to say, but then he noticed who was behind him. His princess, Sansa, approached the heart tree with Septa Mordain on her arm. He took her other hand and kissed it. "Good morning, my princess," he said to her. Oh boy. "Good morning to you too, my prince," she said back with a smile. In the strange light of the godswood, her eyes sparkled. "My lady came to pray before we left for the south, your grace," Mordain told him. He nodded and moved back from the tree. It didn't seem like they should be leaving so soon. He hadn't been here that long, had he? He was so taken by the sights and so absorbed in his thoughts. He did wish he could come up with some answers, but he'd have to take his ponderings to the King's Road. Once Sansa lifted her head, he moved to her side and walked with them back to the yard. And that's actually the end of that section. I was not expecting that. I thought there was another one for some reason. This chapter is... It's not terrible. Here's what I'll say, is that it is readable. It's not the worst thing ever. I did not like it as much as the first one, because I feel like the first chapter had a clear point with what it was doing. Like, it was clear that it was trying to introduce you to the different Lannisters. However, this chapter, on the other hand, is literally Joffrey wandering around the yard and wondering about things that we haven't seen, that we don't have context for, and then some foreshadowing. That's kind of it. It seems like there are quite a few Godswood chapters that are kind of like that. Theon constantly has Godswood chapters. However, his at least tie into other plots, and it's him wondering about, like, stuff that matters and coming up and, like, actually having conversations with Robb. This, on the other hand, is more just Joffrey kind of experiencing different things in Winterfell and thinking, like, what the fuck's up with Bran? Which, fine, but make it more interesting. Hello, it's Editing Frankie once again, here with the final thoughts and outro. I was just gonna use the ones from my original recording from the first episode, but I thought it was weird because, of course, I didn't talk about the shit that I read in what I intended to be the second one. So, overall, the chapters that I read in this episode are better than I was expecting them to be. Despite the fact that it's so old, the content is engaging. The actual style of the writing writing tends to grate on you a lot, but in certain chapters you can overlook it because the content is interesting. Some of the chapters were definitely more interesting than others. I think the first John chapter was pretty compelling despite everything. The parts of the Theon chapter that weren't just that cat chapter intruding in on the chapter. How many times can I say chapter? Jesus Christ. But the parts that weren't carried over from Kat's chapter, those were good. And Joffrey's first chapter of the 2 Joffrey chapters that we read were pretty good. The second Joffrey chapter was, the snippet of that one Joffrey chapter is too short to really give a good consensus on. The Bran Dream chapter was interesting in theory, but in practice, Bran seeing all of these symbols and just being like, what does that mean? It's kind of like, really? Even though he's a 10-year-old boy and it makes sense that he might not get everything, after a while you get tired of him constantly being like, how did that fish get there? That fish is from the south. And it's like, Bran, just stop lampshading it. And like I said, overall, most of the chapters did a pretty decent job of introducing the characters that were involved. We actually got a lot of really decent character introductions throughout this. This is especially prominent in Joffrey's arrival at Winterfell chapter, but the Jon chapter gives us a really nice overview of Jon as a character. So it did seem like I, at the very least, had my character shit together for this. In the next episode, we will be moving on to a specific version that deals with a very specific plot for Jon. So there are a number of chapters that I think I deleted all at once that go along with that. I'm pretty sure that's all we're going to be covering in the next episode. Don't quote me on that because I recorded this months before I'm recording this right now. And all I can tell you for certain is that the Dany chapters that I mentioned a few times throughout this don't come up until the 3rd episode of this series in particular. So anyway, I'm pretty sure the next episode will start with a Bran chapter. So I will see you for that. If you like this episode, like it on the YouTubes, subscribe to the channel and you'll be updated on when that next episode comes out, or whatever the new episode is when you are watching this. It would also be super helpful if you guys could check out the backlog. You can catch up on the last reread series I did, which was my very first Hunger Games fanfic, and check out other videos that I've done. And like I said, I will see you next episode. Bye!